Hey everyone, welcome to this week's podcast. My name is Josh,
I'm Al.
and welcome to this week's podcast. Each week, Al and I we pick a topic or subject on business security, risk, and coming from different perspectives. My being from the cybersecurity industry, Al coming from the physical security industry, and we like to analyze things to see what could possibly go wrong, what we can we learn from it, how can we actually incorporate it into our business. So, Al, what do we got on this week's subject line?
So, um, we are looking at the new government entity, DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency. And there's been a lot of, I guess, hype media things coming out over the last few weeks about what DOGE is doing, good, bad, and ugly. And so I think today we're going to dive into some of this stuff and hopefully educate everyone on some of the stuff that's happening. We unfortunately on this one we have to dive into politics a little bit. I know we said that we were try to be agnostic on politics, but um,
It's
we
national security. I mean, it's not like you can't avoid politics and national security in a
right.
in a hyper converged world.
It's hard not to dive in a little bit. So we will try our best not to impart our political views on anyone. And we will try our best to keep this as unbiased and agnostic as humanly possible given the hyper political environment we live in right now. So, full disclosure, before we start, we are not trying to sway anybody's political opinion, political views. We're merely trying to give you our commentary and views on what we believe is happening and the impact to the security space. So I'll give that disclaimer up front. Um, if any of you are offended or upset by what we have to say, one, we would love you to comment and provide us with some counterpoints. We'd love that. Or, educate us on anything that we may have missed. Totally just putting that out there up front. All that being said, we've had some wildness on the cyber side with the Doge organization. Um, you want to give a quick recap of what you know so far?
So, in the name of government efficiency, Elon Musk and a series of 20-year-olds, one of them at least has a questionable background. If you want to take a look at some of the articles that Brian Krebs, the reporter, InfoSec reporter, has done on his blog on krebsonsecurity.com. By the way, I will encourage anyone. It is a fascinating read, and I think Brian is probably one of the most research intensive journalists that are out there who takes great deal of care to double check, triple check, and quadruple check his sources. So you may not like what he read or what he's posting out there, but let me just say he does uncover the truth, as uncomfortable as it might be. But they've been going around rating different agencies and quote unquote auditing them, which is curious. Let's just say it that way. It's curious. Some of the agencies, I think, the ones that has definitely taken the most spotlight that we know for sure is USAID, but he's also, and I don't believe any one of them actually has cleared the security clearance process, and then I'm going to qualify that as belief because I don't know the timeline or effort or anything like that. But all I know is that to the best of my understanding, and I'm going to qualify that again, to my understanding, they've not gone through the proper clearances. Yet they've somehow managed to access data within several intelligence community agencies. One of them being is the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA. And there's been a couple other agencies too as well, Department of Treasury, as well as Office of Personnel Management.
So I
Uh,
I can tell you from personal experience, I've held a clearance for 18 years now. Some of the highest level security clearances you can have. I can tell you that at at best, the best case scenario for any of these individuals was an interim secret clearance, which is the lowest clearance level to classified information you can have. And anything above that, which CIA tends to sit much higher than your basic level secret information, that's a very in-depth process. The form is an SF-86 form for anyone who wants to go out there and Google it. And you typically go back 7 years of your history, your personal contacts, financial information. I filled out this form way more times than I ever wanted to. I'm very familiar with this process. It takes quite some time to, we're talking months, if best case scenario months. There's a personal interview involved. In addition, they have to follow up with your contacts that you listed on there, and they typically call them and find out what's going on. There's a credit report that's pulled. Then you have to be read in. You have to go through a read-in process, which essentially means you get briefed on the levels of classification, why it's important to safeguard this information. And then after that, you get read into specific programs that you're supporting. So the whole clearance process is based on need to know. That's the key thing there, is you only get access to information that you need to know to do your job. So just from that, again, politics aside, just from that, we have a huge issue here if what people are saying that these people accessed is accurate. Big problem, right? And you can argue, well, DOGE needs to know the information for government efficiency. I'm going to challenge that right now and say, if you're not read into the program, you do not understand the full implications of what you're doing. And baseline financial information without context, you make a decision on that, it can be very dangerous, right?
I think there's a lot of things that we have to ask questions on, and here's my personal take. Okay, the agencies that I've seen them access includes NOAA, the National Ocean Atmosphere Administrative, National Ocean Atmosphere Administration, and I'm gonna butcher that one. FAA, which ironically, what couple plane crashes out of that, question mark, question mark. I'm not gonna go conspiracy theory on that one. I'm not gonna go on the record or anywhere near it saying what they did caused the accidents. I think that is going down a rabbit hole too far. Nor I'm gonna suggest it. I think that is just a fool's run for that. So if anyone who think I'm going that way, you're stupid. I'm gonna say it right off the bat. But the ones besides the intelligence community agencies. So I'm talking about FBI, CIA, NSA, and those. The ones, if I really wanted to control and have influence, and you can see what's going on, the ones that have me greatly and deeply concerned would be OPM. Which, for anybody who don't understand what OPM is the HR of the entire United States government for both federal employees and contractors. Both sides, not one or the other, no, for both. So they are literally HR for the entire US federal government. Not state, but federal government. So literally you would have names, social security numbers, roles, job titles, where they worked at inside OPM, which is why, if anyone didn't realize the significance of the OPM hack several years back, this is the reason why. you have access to a lot of sensitive information and data where people actually really work inside the federal government. And by the way, not just current, but correct me wrong, Al, even past as
Yeah,
well, right?
you have retirees that are lumped into that. You have former employees. I don't know how long they retain the records of former employees, but I do believe it's quite some time. There are over 438 government agencies, sub agencies. All right, so we have a very large government. Let's just we'll cut through that. But we imagine 2.2 million current federal employees, and that doesn't include the contractors, if I'm not mistaken. This is a lot of data. This is a lot of data that, if it's exposed, even 10% of it, right? It's a lot of data, a lot of personal information, and a lot of information can be gleaned. You can connect dots from given portions of information, right? If you put them together, if you're a bad actor. So very sensitive information that is housed within OPM, right? And people who have not gone through the full vetting process are now having access to that. And so red flags, alarms going off, right? I think from like a big picture view, you and I discussed this earlier today, like they have fallen in love with the outcome, but spiting the process. Okay. And the problem, I think collectively as a country, yes, we want the government to be more efficient. We want to save money. We don't want wasted tax money. Yeah. Okay. All on board with that. I think we both agree. Yes, that makes sense. But we have to follow a specific process in order to get that outcome. And if we start taking shortcuts, we go outside the process and the safeguards in place, we create more problems than we're solving, right?
Yeah, I think this is there's so many questions that we need to just fundamentally pause and just ask ourselves some questions. So, for example, one of the very first so-called agencies to quote unquote be shut down and to be declared a waste of money is USAID. For those of you who don't understand USAID is essentially a ability for us to project and help other countries around the globe to help with medicine and to help support other countries. I get it. It seems like a total waste of money, but when you look at the total budget and everything that is contributing, it's barely what 0.5% of the entire U.S. federal budget, I think. And yes, I'm going to concede a point. 0.5% is some savings, okay? But you also have to think about the long-term consequences of actually not having a support of an agency like USAID. For example, are you now allowing a adversarial entity to start influencing other governments or potentially enabling other governments to fall because you weren't there to support? For those of you who are classically trained as psychologists or sociologists or people who understand this, there's an idea or concept of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I encourage anyone who actually understands that or doesn't even know that, go take a look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But basically, if you actually look at if you look at the pyramid, basically that Maslow has proposed, some of the very basic two blocks of the very bottom of the pyramid that makes up the fundamental basis of the pyramid. First one is physiological needs, being air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing. If those aren't needs are taken care of, you can't go towards the next one, which is the safety needs, like personal safety, employment, reassurance, health, property. We are fundamentally starting to break some of these hierarchy of needs basically in some of these third world countries. My concern there is by removing it, you create a power vacuum overnight, by the way.
Right.
And then fundamentally, you're allowing any groups that we self proclaim we take a stand on, either left or right, to fill that void. And then consequently, as a need to project or support it and everything like that, you now introduce an unstable geopolitical element, such as wars, fights, battles, disease, famines, all in those areas. And that just completely just leads to a series of meltdowns just everywhere. It's not going to be like one giant world war. It's going to start off, by death by 10,000 cuts, essentially. Cut here, cut there, cut here. But it adds up to a point where you start realizing it takes an exponential amount of effort to actually to extricate yourself from that. So sure, yes, we save ourselves, let's say, $1 billion in this. But for us to exert effort to police that area, to quell it down, to restore order, to project military force, that might cost us $100 billion. So in other words, the so-called cost savings that we're talking about isn't realized because we rather fight a war than actually feed people.
And it's important to understand, I think, from the perspective of like geopolitical stability. Why, I talked to a lot of people who are like, well, we shouldn't be paying for X, Y, and Z service in another country. And I totally understand the criticisms. I really do. I think I'm not saying that USAID is without fault and maybe some of their spending was faulty. Yeah, I got it. There's probably certain things that we shouldn't be paying for, or we should at least be auditing why we're spending money in certain things or why we're supporting certain programs in certain countries. Totally on board with that. But I think what's important for everyone to understand from a market perspective is USAID is a vector for stability throughout the globe, especially in places where our supply chain may be dependent on something, right? So it's, for example, if we need steel from an area that's impoverished and we want to support development so we can continue to get steel from that area, USAID can come in with economic development programs, social development programs to train the local population on how to operate that steel mill or operate the mine, which then helps our nation, have access to raw materials and resources at a reasonable price, fair trade price, so that we can continue to operate our economy effectively, right? And so if we don't understand that tie-in, we don't understand that this is essentially a vector to boost development in developing nations, so we can then hopefully encourage trade and globally build the global economy, right? I think there's a misconception that if we don't build the global economy, we can focus the energy here in the United States and grow our economy. And unfortunately, I mean, the reality of the situation is we don't have enough raw material in the US to power our economy. We are very dependent upon exports from other countries on goods, just already prepackaged goods, but we're also reliant on raw material. And so when you consider, I think USAID has a $23 billion budget for disbursements, right? Globally. If you cut out that $23 billion, how are you going to supplement the economic development to gain your raw materials back? Because $23 billion is not enough to develop the infrastructure in the United States to be a self-powered economy. Not even close. I mean, a data center project, one data center is $1 billion capital investment in the United States. That's one industry, one sector, one thing.
One building,
Building,
one building in
building.
a geographic square, 2 or 3 square block area.
The other thing I don't think people realize, we don't have enough power plants in the United States to power the economy of the future. So we have to build more power plants, which means we have to get the raw material from somewhere to do this. So when we start, and I understand people's aversion here, I really do, but it's important to understand that the federal bureaucracy, the way that it has grown and become, we didn't grow it overnight. It's happened over several years. To think that we're going to turn a light switch and all of a sudden stop all this bureaucracy from happening, I think is it's a pipe dream. I mean, there's a lot of dependencies that have been put in place for a reason, because the dependencies that have been put in place have been put in place to maintain stability geopolitically. All right. And so when you destabilize a lot of things geopolitically, you actually make things cost a lot more. And we may not see the impact here directly in the United States because we have two oceans separating us from a lot of the world. But when it comes to raw material costs, when it comes to other countries' labor forces being depleted because they're engaged in civil war, it means that raw materials globally are going to cost more because you've now removed a potential supplier out of the market due to conflict.
I don't think it's just that. I think we have to understand, people, say tariff this, tariff that, build this, build that. We can do this ourselves. I don't disagree. United States can do that. Okay. But at what cost? And more importantly, the length of time. How long would it take for you actually to procure the talent, procure the facilities, procure the training? It is a combination of people, process, and technology to get any kind of output overnight is not reasonable. It's going to take time. So my question to anybody here, do you really want to wait the next, at least 12 to 18 months for anything remotely to get started? Probably a lot of anything that you're talking about in terms of this so-called do-it-yourself revolution movement that you want to call it, it's going to take, at least 3 to 4 years, 5 years for any capital investment to be actualized. You need to have the talent, how to do things. You have to train them. You have to have the facilities, the technology, the machinery, the tooling. You have to build a whole supply chain, even domestically, let alone globally, to actually fund any of these initiatives. And, coming back to, we're talking for USAID, this is kind of where I kind of go, you know, it isn't about just, building other countries and the relationships for the materials, but it is just building friends. You know, you need friends in this world. To be fundamentally without a friend can have serious consequences. And the good example is, I think every major historian that is out there would look at World War II. I don't know how long it was, but the United Kingdom, Great Britain, was by itself for a period of time, fighting against the Axis powers. And they were alone on this. And historians, if I'm not mistaken, have maintained and held the belief that had the Japanese not attacked the United States on December 1941 and waited until the fall of Great Britain, then we would have actually been next, and we would have fallen, and Great Britain would have fallen, and the Axis powers would have won. It was because, by virtue of having a friend, the United States, and then by virtue of the United States having its friends coming in, joining in alongside Great Britain, like the powers of Canada, joining in, did it actually change it started changing the tide, and it started making the influence where, it was backing up Great Britain and making a support for them. And that's what led to the consequences of turning, the war in World War II in Germany. And I think people need to understand this is, just because we stop our efforts doesn't mean that other adversarial nations are going to stop themselves. I'm not going to name any of them, but I'm going to say there's plenty of them who are making serious and significant multi-billion, if not multi-trillion, T as in trillion-dollar investments into multiple countries globally. And I'm not talking about just money. I'm also talking about infrastructure. I'm talking about capital investments into their economy to build that talent and processes to support their economy. And you know what? They're actually the number 2 global economy making that kind of investment. And they are rapidly gaining power. And it's the one country that this administration is choosing to pick a fight on. And, if they're so afraid of them, you don't, shelter and turtle. Let me be the first person to say, from a cyber defense perspective, I've seen what happens when companies get turtled. At some point, when that turtle shell cracks, you have a hard outside and you have a soft inside. You have nothing stopping you on the inside. It doesn't work. You have to be able to move forward. You have to have friends to come alongside you to protect you, because that one moment of weakness is going to be your downfall.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think, I mean, if we just look at it from a military perspective, I don't think we've unilaterally gone to war in almost 40 years, 50 years, since I think since even the Vietnam War, which is a very contentious war. We were still going to war with the Southern Vietnamese military. We were still propping them up. So even from a military perspective, we can't do it alone. It's just impossible. And I think a lot of people just don't quite understand the complexities of geopolitics, and how really reliant globally most powerful economies are on the global supply chain, to include the country that you mentioned, or the adversary you mentioned. I mean, there's a reason why there is foreign direct investment in a lot of these emerging markets. It's because it's understood that these markets will eventually stabilize, they will be developed, and there will be a lot of good economic development between partner nations. So that's definitely something that I think is overlooked. It's very easy to look at numbers and say, "Oh, we're spending 25 billion here for this or that," but it's also, we have to understand that, like, there's several different type of investment strategies that we got to take as a nation. I mean, if we look at Germany, we look at Japan, we look at South Korea. We went to war with all three of those countries. Well, not so much South Korea, but we did support South Korea in the Korean conflict, right? So my point is, those were very long-term investments in stability and economic development and infrastructure investment. Arguably, those three nations are some of our most valuable trading partners. So I think we have to kind of take a long look at this, of not so much in 4 years or 5 years, what does this look like? But in 50, 60 years, some of these emerging economies, developing nations, can they be like a Japan, Germany, or South Korea for us when it comes to the trade partnership and the economic development? I'm a big believer in, these are long-term investments. You cannot just assume in 4 years or 5 years or 6 years that you're going to drastically change the culture of a nation, or how they work or economic infrastructure. But you can, over time, focus on things, develop things, help them focus their economy to your benefit. And there's nothing wrong with that. And really build an economic bridge there, which then in turn, you have a stronger pull on geopolitical stability, right? Which I think ultimately is the end state. If we can create global stability, right, then we're all able to feed ourselves. We're all able to execute on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and on that bottom three of the pyramid. We are moving, everyone is moving forward together, right? So, and I think that's ultimately the goal here. I think that's ultimately what people want. They don't want to see U.S. troops intervening in every conflict, which unfortunately, pulling the plug on USAID could very well mean that, right? And being a former military guy myself, I can tell you one of the one of the toughest missions you can do is a peacekeeping mission where you're jumping in the middle of two warring parties and trying to keep the peace, right? And you're trying to keep the peace so your you know your country can get food at a reasonable price, because this place that you're in has 60% of the wheat crop of the world, like Ukraine, right? Where you you essentially have to come in to warring parties and stop them from fighting and get enough stability so you can actually feed people, right? I mean, that is a tough position to be in. And it's not a position that I want to see any U.S. troops having to engage in, simply because we've pulled the plug on development funds, right?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the thing people need to understand is that, when we know from history, like anytime there is famine, anytime people are suffering, people are so open to doing anything so they can go to sleep at night with a full belly.
Yeah,
Like you don't understand like how motivating hunger can be on the human being, that they are willing to throw everything, baby with the bathwater, to do it. If you want a case in point, um, the sanctions upon that was imposed upon Germany post World War One is what allowed for Adolf Hitler to rise to power, and that led to the consequences of World War Two. Had we theoretically not sanctioned Germany or Prussia at that point into the Stone Ages to plunge them into such an economic disrepair or disrepute, I think there may have been potentially a very different outcome at that point. And, you can argue with me that all you want, but I think history speaks for itself. The fact that the Germans were so, there was just so much despair with famine and just hunger, and, morale was low and everything like that. It allowed for a new power to step in at that point and just allow them to just really take power and take seat and take hold. And, what was the cost? Just think of all the millions of lives lost in in World War II. I'm not even just talking about the attempt to exterminate another human race, another culture. I'm just talking about the soul toll in life, just fighting the battles
I,
back and forth
I think it's
inside.
like, I'm not 100% correct on this, but I think it was like 4 million men died in World War II.
Yep.
Two,
Think of also think of also the amount of money it also took to
right.
fight that battle too as well.
And
Uh,
in Europe was, for all intents and purposes, leveled as a continent. I mean, the devastation across Europe was insane. Which led to the Geneva Conventions. The outcome of World War II really led to a lot of these things being put in place for a reason. Because I mean that the entire continent was essentially leveled. Great Britain leveled from the bombings. Germany was leveled, uh, and I mean the western part of Russia. I mean the Germans and the Russian army, the Soviet army, I guess is what we would call it, fought some of the bloodiest campaigns on the Eastern Front. Um, and
and and we can also look at just the net effect of World War II, how long we actually got held in the Cold War in itself.
right,
I mean, that was, even though no quote unquote battle was fought, but just think about the psychological toll it took. Just, wondering, will you wake up the next day, or, would people's flesh be melting off because of a nuke?
yeah. So I mean, there is a lot of chess pieces here on the chessboard, which I think we're just flicking pieces off arbitrarily, not realizing that there is a strategy in place in order to get the outcome we want. So,
Yeah, and
uh,
I think this is a classic case um of just, cutting off one's nose to spite one's face. It is really egregiously short-term thinking. But, let's just say, for the sake of conversation, let's talk that, let's assume the president is right. There is corruption and everything like that. In audit, there is a fundamental requirement that there be independence. Okay.
Right.
And I challenge anyone, do you really think when you drill down into all the major projects and numbers and spending that you can sufficiently understand an entire agency of $28 billion? You can boil it down to, to figure out where all the waste is and where it's being legitimately spent. Are you really able to get that done within 2 weeks to that degree? And might I add too, by the way, there is maybe not a conflict, but I will concede there is, no there. I will concede there's no definitive conflict. I will pick a fight with you on perceived conflict. USAID was, and I'm saying was, I don't know if is, but was investigating Elon Musk for potential fraud associated with SpaceX. So, pot calling kettle black much in my book. Um, the one agency that systematically has been officially been quote unquote wiped off the map is USAID, which also happens to be the one agency that was investigating Elon Musk. Now, I'm not I'm not saying that there is a conspiracy here, but the optics, I'm going to not concede on that. It does not look good. You have to admit that the optics does not look good on it.
Optics. I mean, I think the optics on a lot of this look bad. SpaceX is a government contractor, right? They do work for the U.S. government, and the CEO of SpaceX, allegedly, got access to Treasury Department, and that is all the financial data of other government contracts, other government contractors, who has what, how much they're being paid, how much they're charging. I think that there is fundamentally an issue there, that you have a personality who is doing business for the government who now has essentially an unfair advantage, because they understand, they have all the financial information for all these other government contracts and projects. So what is to stop him from either having SpaceX bid on some of these other contracts, or creating other companies which will then assume these contracts? I think that is a big issue. As we kind of pivot to the insider threat piece, I mean, that's, that to me is a big no-no, right? We want to, I'm big on a competitive marketplace. I think taxpayers should get the best
Value.
best value
Yeah.
they can, right? I don't see how you're able to do that if one party has all the cards in their hand, right? It just doesn't seem reasonable to me that would be the case. So I, personally, I'm a little uncomfortable with that.
Oh, you're a little uncomfortable. I'm very uncomfortable because I'm coming from as an auditor, assessor person. Okay, I realize I have an independence. I'm providing an independent perspective, and if there is clear conflicts, the process I would go is I would deconflict
Right.
like crazy. And I would, like, if there was a section that I was potentially auditing myself and the client insists I need to do it, I'd still bring in a third party just to handle that section of the piece. So this way I'm removed from it and I'm demonstrating independence where and if I can. So this way I'm not creating a bias or unintended bias. It's just like why in security I'm such a huge advocate on the cyber side, why IT does not do security. Even though they are part of the security function, they should not lead the security function, because the IT mindset is very operational, whereas the security is very risk driven.
Right.
Yes, they both work hand in hand together to manage that risk, but at the end of the day, you need someone to quote unquote act as a check and balance on both sides. Security acts as a check and balance to the operations, and then the IT folks act as a check and balance for the operations of the business. You work hand in hand one another. In this case, there is no clear independence. This is my biggest problem with it, is the independence factor of this. And that makes me hugely concerned. And, forget conflict of interest aside. It's just, the independence factor. I really have some concerns, especially when you're going from someone going from agency to agency to agency to agency, and you're making snap decisions on whether the agency lives or dies in a couple of days. That is just no way to look at things, because you don't understand where everything goes. You don't understand also the value of what you're doing. A classic phrase my family likes to bang and harp on is, it takes money to make money. Well, if we're making that kind of investment, aka money, you have to understand that it is not instant gratification. It is a long term, to your point, Al, long term strategic changes. It's going to take time, because you're trying to change essentially a generation. And it may take a generation or two before you actually start seeing the fruits of your labor. It's like going from a desert, like, think, oh God, I'm thinking this was, I think like Abu Dhabi, or one of the big Emirates cities, taking a desert city and then transforming it into a magical oasis. It doesn't happen overnight. You're talking about infrastructure and all the sorts of transformations before it can actually become the so-called luxury resort that you want it to be.
Yeah, absolutely, totally agree with all that. I think there's a component to this too that people are missing, is that culturally too, government employees, they work on it. If you've ever worked in the government or worked for the government as a contractor, you understand that the culture there, working, like we like to call it, the Fed, working for the Fed, um, it's a different culture than private sector. It's a different mentality. It's a, government employees work differently. And I always say, like, people will tell me, oh well, you know they all, they're all terrible. They move slow, this and that. And I always tell everyone that we are all products of our environment. The government environment, the way it works, the way the government moves, the way it's funded, um, the 4 year cycle on the executive branch, and the 2 to 6 year cycle on the congressional branch. The environment is different. We have to fundamentally accept that the way the government works, what it's expecting from its employees, is going to be different than a private sector company. Private sector, we're here to make money, right? The company needs to make money to survive. We provide a product or a service, and we sell that product and service for a profit, for a good business. And then we either reinvest the money to expand the business, or, the owners take their cut, and we just keep doing what we're doing. The government doesn't work that way, and it has never worked that way. And we have to understand and accept that the government will work differently, because one, there's congressional controls put on the executive branch, right? There's certain things the government can do, and there's certain things they can't do, and that's federal law. And good, bad, or indifferent, that just is what it is. Furthermore, there's a funding component, right? The government is not making a profit, is not seeking to make a profit. It's just seeking to deliver services to the taxpayer. So we have to recognize that there's certain limitations financially that are placed on the government, which create an environment which government employees have adapted to their environment. So they work the way they do because of the way the environment is. So I say all this to say that when you come into a company or a organization with a drastically different mindset, and you want to do essentially what I see Elon Musk and the Doge organization trying to do is a big culture shift, right? Change management culture shift for how the government runs itself, right? Well, you have people who are used to doing things a certain way for decades, and now you're coming in, you're rocking the boat, I'm not saying it's good, bad, or ugly either way. I'm just saying that this is what's happening. Um, there is going to be pushback on a new culture. There always is. Anytime you come in and try to do change management to any organization or change culture, there's always pushback. There's always resentment. There's all these little things that occur, which, in my opinion, increase the likelihood of an insider risk, right? Which inadvertently they could be creating more problems than they are solving by taking the approach that they're taking. And you don't have to look far, in our history as the US government to find examples of people who, are deemed insider risk because they felt they were being slighted by the organization, or they felt that the government was doing the wrong thing, and they took it upon themselves to either leak information or, be courted by a foreign adversary on the espionage side. So my big concern here is if you move too fast, you'd make too many changes, too many shifts. You've created an environment where people feel like the only way I'm going to be heard, the only way I'm going to be able to make impact and get people to understand what's happening here is by violating the law and potentially disclosing information or becoming the insider risk, right?
Well, I don't think it's a little bit bigger than that. And it's because I think people are using very different metrics to compare private sector and public sector on an unconscious level. They try to measure and try to compare the public sector, like the federal government, and try to hold it to a Silicon Valley standard, like the fail fast, fail often model. But they don't allow the federal government to fail fast and fail often too as well, because they look at it as,
want that, to be honest.
Well, not just that, but they hold them they try to hold them to that standard, but they don't give them the same latitude to fail fast, fail often. So if you're not unfamiliar with that model, and I'm a very Silicon Valley proponent of this, as someone who does work, in Silicon Valley with clients in Silicon Valley, but I also work in state and federal governments on different contracts or supporting it. There's a very, very different set of mindsets on there. In the private sector, to fail fast, fail often is you try it, great, doesn't work, it's just going to cost me some money, move on. Okay. But there's a rule, I will say, maybe not law, but more rule. If not, and by law, it's at least implied that to do that is constitutes as waste of taxpayer money and taxpayer dollars.
Correct.
And we consider it as fraud or whatever. You can label it as wasteful or anything like that. But why are we, if we apply that Silicon Valley model to any government agency and we held to that agency would be tarred and feathered, but the private sector entity wouldn't. Shareholders don't, generally don't tar and feather the leadership for that. And I say generally,
they have the ability. I mean, if a shareholder is mad or doesn't like the direction, they can pull their money out, right? They
exactly.
Pull their money out and invest in something else where you feel it's better spent. But fundamentally, the government doesn't work that way, and I think like that's the crux of the issue. Is like we, as taxpayers, we don't have the opportunity to pull our money out of well, we don't like this federal agency, we're going to pull our money. We don't control that. We are told we're going to pay our taxes every year. The money's collected, and then we elect people to manage that, right?
Yeah. I think there's also another thing is too, there's an unspoken requirement of anything that the US government actually does and implements needs to be perfection or as close to perfection.
Zero defect mentality for the government, right?
Yeah, and it has to be perfect on the day one. It's the implied requirement upon taxpayers that is imposed upon any agency. And number one, not possible. We're all humans. But number two, I will concede definitely, though, that this bar is significantly higher for the public sector agencies. Why? Because typically the public sector agencies is charged with things like national security or critical infrastructure, systems that we come to depend on, like 911, defense, maybe taxes, IRS, whatever information system or technology or platform that we're using. There is an expectation that I as a taxpayer contribute to X amount of dollars into the machine, even though it's pennies, but I expect it to work well and work perfectly out the door. And anytime there's a failure or a break or anything like that, we hold them to a very, very different account. So, like, for example, over the weekend, the PlayStation Network went out. Okay, great. Big whoop. It's out. But imagine if, a major critical system such as getting your tax refunds back is offline from the IRS. How much hell, that a taxpayer would hold account to them. It's like, you're withholding my money, you're holding my refund. It's a whole different hold to account and accountability at that point. And I don't think people understand that, unconsciously we hold them to that level.
I really think that comes from, it's the involuntary nature of like the withholding of tax money, right? Like we don't directly, at least we don't get a vote on it, right? Like it's your W-2, it gets deducted, right? Your employer pays you, you're on your W-2, right? And then you get the taxes get withheld, and you have no control of that. It gets withheld, You've got to fill out your form every year. You get issued your paycheck, the money comes out, and you don't know where it really goes. It's taken from your paycheck, and it's an involuntary function, right? Whereas like PlayStation, right? I wanted this, I paid for it. It was a voluntary. I paid for it, and I knew what the risks potentially were, but I paid for it, and so in my mind, I can comprehend. Well, it's understandable. Like things don't always work. I may be mad about it, but it was a voluntary motion. I willfully chose to sign up for the PlayStation Network, or the Xbox Network, whatever it is, right? I've and then oh well, they didn't deliver on services, and I have a legal recourse, right? Like if it's that bad, I know that I have a legal recourse that I can take, and I can hold them accountable. I think the reason the Doge concept took off is because there's a perception that there is no accountability in government, that the money is involuntary taken away from you, and you're forced to pay it, and you don't necessarily know where it went. You don't know what it's being spent on. You don't know where it's being allocated. And even if you try to get the information through FOIA requests, or and this, the funny thing is, there's always a congressional budget is put out. It's all public information. You can see every agency puts out a financial report. But to your point earlier, this is so much information to understand and to look at. The average person is going to look at this and say, I don't want to read through the phone book of financial statements that my federal government has put out to really understand where each penny is going. It is just too much information. The volume of information is overwhelming. And so I think, when it comes down to it, this idea of Doge takes off because there's a perception that this problem is so big and pervasive that we've got to get control of what's going on, where the spending is going, this and that, right? And so on the surface, when you say, hey, listen, the government is wasting your money, you're involuntarily being withheld money to go into something, and now let me throw a match on fire and say, or throw a match on gasoline and say, oh yeah, it's being used for this thing that you don't agree with ideologically or politically. That's where your money that's involuntary to be taken out is going, and now everyone is freaking out on both sides of the aisle, right? But I think when we have to take a step back and consider, wait a second, how big is this problem? How big is, what the volumes of information that are needed to really get a hold of this problem? I think if you take a step back and you say, wait a second, there's no way in 3 weeks, in 21 days, that an organization was able to figure this thing out. And I'm only talking about 1 year of budget. I mean, we could go back 10, 15, 20, 30 years. That is a massive amount of data to comb through and to really understand how big of a potential issue this is, right? So pull the plug on anything, or to come in with this big like cultural shift, that they were pushing that they are still pushing on federal employees, I don't think it's going to get the outcome people think it's going to get, and I think it's going to create a lot more issues than it's going to solve in the short term. And I think we all need to collectively take a step back and say, wait a second, from every different perspective, from our information security, from our national security, from our economic stability to, how are we going to interact with other nations to help us, through any of these issues? Is this really the right answer? Do we really have the full picture? Do we really understand what's going on? Right. Um, just my 2 cents there on that. I just think we need to really be conscious of the full implications here. The second, third, fourth, fifth order effects of what could happen, right?
Yeah, and and that's just the start of it. Like I also have some concerns about even the process of actually how they're doing it. So, for example, they're connecting into all these IT systems. Like Treasury would be paying various defense contractors on both public projects as well as probably top secret projects. So like money to like Lockheed Martin or Boeing or anything, potentially there's national secrets implications just by virtue of having access to information. So who knows what stealth projects, black projects that are in there that we may not be aware of that is in Treasury's visibility.
And this, I mean, this brings up a big, data privacy concern, as far as I'm concerned, is we're taking information from a secure server that has to have specific controls set on it, congressionally mandated, right? We're taking information off of that, which is very sensitive information, and we're potentially, again, going off of what the news has reported, private servers and Gmail accounts, right, which can be hacked by an adversary. Now they know every. So I think we have to play chess here. If you have the information of every company the U.S. government is paying for goods and services, right? You know who the people that they're paying at said companies for goods and services,
And for what too?
and for what. That is a huge issue, right? Because now, and I'm going to say something that's going to sound like a conspiracy theory, but it's not, because this has actually happened in the past. If you really wanted to cause disruption to the government, targeted assassinations of key personnel are on the table, especially if you know who's doing what, where they are, and what they're doing for the government. This is a big, big problem. And I want to highlight, when it comes to insider threat, there is a misconception that insider threats intentionally are being insider threats. A lot of times an insider threat are unwitting. They don't actually know that they are an insider threat. They've been hacked, or their systems have been hijacked, and they don't even know it. And they are enabling an adversary to exfiltrate information, sensitive information, right? So when you consider, again, not going to dive into Elon Musk's motivations or the Doge team's motivations or anything like that, they could literally be unwittingly the biggest insider risk to the United States, because they're trying to achieve an outcome to help the American people, but in turn, unwittingly have caused egregious harm to national security.
Yeah, and I think that's what worries me, because it's like, to your point, federal government has requirements. Like you are supposed to download it onto certain hardened, secure desktops and laptops. Like, when I was working at the FCC, I had very strict controls, like what I can or cannot, issue out to my personal email accounts or even my work accounts. I also, by virtue of public records, all my emails that are getting sent in and out as there is also subject to public records too as well. Because I'm a government contractor. I could also think from a transparency standpoint too as well. There's those factors. I'm also mindful of the fact too, in the federal government. I think was it I forgot who was it, ZDNet or one of the major tech publications, that there were a lot of new DNS entries now pointing to a cloud service called Inventory, Inventery or something like that. Now pointing to them. Federal government has rules about procuring government services for cloud companies. It's called FedRAMP. And, you're bypassing that entire authorization process and everything. And by the way, FedRAMP is like a good 18-24 month process to verify it has, decent security controls, some basics on there, and it's third party attested. And I don't know if Inventory has gone through it, but I can tell you it's most certainly not on the marketplace list. And so there's all these questions in my head that just going, okay, this data sitting here, here, and here, and here, and here. It's like think Oprah, you get some of the government data, you get some of the government data, you get some of the government data. And it's not just some, it's like all of it. And, if foreign governments can hack Gmail accounts and get into journalists, what makes you think better that, a foreign adversary can't get into these various, members of Doge accounts and actually, siphon off the data? And by the way, remember, it's data, so you don't need to actually, quote unquote, it's not like you go to a store and steal a cell phone or mascara or, steal toothpaste or toothbrush or something like that. And behind locked cages, is all you need is just take a copy of it. Right. And once you take a copy, the copy is 100% just as good as the original. And you won't notice it until someone happens to take a look or gets an alert or gets suspicious or other side gets messy, whatever. But it's usually by sheer dumb luck that you find out your information has been taken. And at that point, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. You can't put the horse back in the barn. It is gone out there. And God knows what kind of irreparable, consequential, permanent, and strategic long-term harm does it do. And by the way, I'm not talking just economic harm, especially if it comes to the fact that, intelligence community, national security information gets out. You're not talking loss of dollars here. You're talking something more consequential. I'm talking about loss of lives, loss of human lives at that point. And not just human assets, like people that we've cultivated abroad. I'm talking about losing lives, period, because, what happens, someone turns, and I'm going to go conspiracy theory here. I'm going to completely admit on that one. But someone finds out where our nuclear arsenal or nuclear waste is and something like that, and finding out how to get a hold of that and then, detonates a dirty bomb. Or the fact that we lose members of the intelligence community, people who work for a 3-letter agency, their lives is now at risk. I get there is a time to be, dollar wise, but in this case, I really have to say, remember, you can't buy a life back. And I'm going to classify, there's many moments. I'm not going to call this entire endeavor futile, but I would say there's many moments in this entire process of in the name of government efficiency where I have to pause and I go, it really sounds like penny-wise, dollar foolish.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to agree with you on that. There is the whole aspect of the the clandestine stuff, the black budget that potentially could get disclosed. But I think there's other issues too that people I don't think are picking up on, in the sense of, what about all the legal information that potentially could get released that's under case review right now, or there's legal holds on stuff, right? I mean, this is quite common even in big companies, where you have information that has to either be preserved or safeguarded under attorney-client privilege, or because there's a case pending and it's got to be kept confidential for the legal process to play out. There's the HIPAA information, right? People's, with regard to OPM, people have reasonable accommodation letters in. They've had to disclose medical conditions for reasonable accommodation. So when we think about the lawsuits that could come after this because of the mishandling of HIPAA information, classified information, legal hold information, Um, you're talking about a massive, massive fine against the federal government that would have to be settled out of court, right? So even if you save, let's just assume you save the 23 billion for USAID, but in your attempt to save money and make the government more efficient, you cause $100 billion of a legal settlement. What did you really save at that point, right? You spied the process for the outcome, and you actually failed at both, right? So I think that there's so many big implications here that I don't think people are looking at. I mean, everyone, look, get it. Everybody wants to save money. Everybody wants to get the best value. I think you and I are both on board with that. But
Yeah.
are we really achieving that outcome if we're spiting the process? And in my opinion, it's going to be no. We're not. We're actually causing a lot more issues, which can't be fully realized until the case is actually hit, and the damage is actually exposed. So I think that to bringing it back to insider threat, I think like you really have to consider some of these things as you move through any. I mean, and look, what's happening in the U.S. government at Doge is it's not uncommon. I mean, today Facebook announced layoffs. Right, they're moving to an efficiency model. Big tech in general has been kind of trending in that direction, optimizing efficiencies, things like that. But you have to consider whether you're public sector or private sector, what conditions are you setting for the people that work for you? What conditions are you setting for yourself, which for the sake of saving on a quarterly earnings statement or a balance sheet or a year-end earnings statement, did you potentially set yourself up for a financial disaster down the road or a security disaster for that matter?
Right. And again, there's just a lot of things that you just kind of go, ooh, what could go wrong?
Right, right.
You know, it's just you're just setting yourself for a lot of long term pain. And then, again, sure, like to your point, you save $23 billion today. Only you're having to spend $230 billion down the road for God knows what.
Right, right.
You have to look at the long term chess moves and chess plays. And by the way, I think this is part of one of the biggest challenges I think we have in American society is our society is built on short term thinking. We're not built on long term thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, unfortunately, in this case, that's going to hurt us a lot if we don't, at least slow this process down. Personal opinion again, slow this process down and really map out what the implications could be. Right. I mean, yes, again, we all want to get the best value for the taxpayer. Nobody's arguing against that, but we also want to protect the country. We also want to make sure that, I mean, government employees need to be protected as well. I mean, they're U.S. citizens just like all the rest of us, right? So if their information is out there and they're getting doxxed because somebody has a political beef with the administration at the time, right? That's an issue. That's a problem. That's
Or the
not
administration doxing the individual intentionally or unintentionally.
right. I mean, it's we have data privacy laws for a reason. We have safeguards and controls for a reason. There's really no reason, in my opinion, to be circumventing that simply to save a dollar. Like that is inappropriate, in my opinion.
Yeah. But I definitely will agree, with you, and I think you'll agree with me here that, the intent behind Department of Government Efficiency is well founded. The keyword is intent.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
The mission is honorable. That's the line though. It's how they're executing the mission that's where we have some concerns.
Here's how I'll kind of break it down for people. It's like we send U.S. troops overseas to take on a mission, right? For me, like, okay, go to Afghanistan, combat ISIS, prevent the Taliban from taking over, safeguard the population. So if we send troops somewhere to go do a job and we just go on a killing spree and just like level the entire country and commit a bunch of genocide, right? Okay, yeah, maybe we achieved the outcome, but the process, everyone is criticizing like, no, you act like that was not what we asked you to do, right? Like, so I equate it. And I don't want to. I don't want to get blown up. I'm not equating Doge with genocide. Don't confuse my words. But what I'm saying is, there's an expectation when we ask the government to do something that it's done ethically, it's done safely, and it's done to prevent the most harm possible. And I don't know if that's what we're doing on this one. The intent is good. 100% agree with you on that. The intent is good, and I've said it about 10 times now on this podcast. Yes, we want the taxpayer to get the best value ever. But we also want the nation to be safe and secure. We don't want to chip away at the national security. We want the information to be protected. We want the culture shift if it's going to happen, and it probably needs to happen to some degree, but we don't want to create an environment where we created more insider threats and potential rogue actors to divulge more information because they're upset. And we definitely don't want federal employees to be put in a position where they're fearing against reprisals and things like that. Like that's not the process we want to follow. We want to do this in the safest, least harmful way possible.
Yeah. Okay. So, closing statements. What do we want to say for this week?
So, accountability is big, but we got to hold those who are responsible for accountability. We also have to hold them accountable, right? So we can't just pick and choose when we want to be accountable. I think we were watching that TikTok video that you sent me earlier, but I think he hit on a key point. Is when you see something wrong, it doesn't matter who's doing the wrong. You have to speak up and say this is wrong. Even if you voted for the current administration or you didn't, when you see wrong, you got to call it out. You got to call out wrong, right? You hold the people accountable, even the ones that you agree with politically. You got to hold them accountable. They're not doing things the right way. Hold them accountable, right? So I think accountability is big. I'd carry that over to all the guys working in the private sector as well. You just got to hold people accountable and make sure you're doing things ethically, and you're really looking at the big picture of what harm could be done. I mean, private sector, obviously we're always trying to be more profitable and make more money, and there's nothing wrong with that. But are we doing it at the expense of somebody else in a way that we're causing harm, and potentially is a short-term gain going to cause long-term pain, right? And I think that's what I would leave everybody with is really hold people accountable, and then really consider all the implications of what you're asking for and what you're doing.
Yeah, I love that right there. You're saying, short-term gain for long-term pain. That's not something that you want, because that is just pain. Lots and lots of pain. This comes to mind for at least this week's podcast. It's Latin, so apologize if I sounding and I butcher this. I'm not Latin, and I never took Latin in college. But the saying goes, "Quis custodiet ipsos custodies," or "Who watches the watchers." And I think that's the big one here. Is yes, Doge is trying to be that watcher, but again, who's watching them?
Absolutely.
We shall find out in next week's episode.
We shall find out. So, and I will close with this. I hope, I really wish the best for them. I really do. I hope this gets sorted out, and I hope that, we move this thing forward in a positive way. I want the best for the government. I want the best for all of us. So I'm not trying to trash, what they're doing, but at the same time, it's like we gotta understand the implications of what we're doing here. To like let's get the outcome that everybody wants, not just the outcome that a few people want, right?
Yeah, I'm worried a little bit bigger. I mean, but this is me going down the rabbit hole of having more concerns about separation of powers, constitutional aspects, none of which matters in this podcast episode, at least. I think there's some bigger concerns I would have, but we could save it for another episode.
We can go on a constitutional crisis podcast and talk about some of that. But yeah,
national security impacts economic security, which impacts corporate security, which then also impacts cybersecurity and physical security. Totally. Welcome to convergence at its finest.
Absolutely. So,
all right, everyone. That's it for this episode of this podcast. I'm Josh, and that's Al over there. We'll see you next week. Be sure to share the podcast with a friend, or leave a comment below or subscribe. We always like to hear feedback, criticisms, or comments welcome anytime. So take care, everyone.